When Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani first announced that he was running to become New York City's next mayor, he had no name recognition, and polls indicated that he had less than 1% of the votes. Over the course of his affordability-focused campaign, support for Mamdani exploded, with a massive amount of New Yorkers coming together to volunteer for him. In an upset victory, he ended up winning the Democratic nomination, receiving the most votes ever for any candidate in a New York City mayoral primary, and he is now the frontrunner in the three-way race between himself, Republican nominee Curtis Sliwa, and independent Andrew Cuomo. While Mamdani has been endorsed by many Democrats, and undoubtedly gained a remarkable following amongst the public, he has no shortage of detractors, with many of them calling him an extremist that will destroy the city if elected. But are his policies actually radical and potentially catastrophic, or are they reasonable? In this video, we'll answer that question about one of Mamdani's most well-known campaign promises, freezing the rent. I can quickly dispel the notion that freezing the rent is radical or somehow fringe by pointing out that in one of the mayoral debates, when asked who would support a rent freeze, 5 out of the 7 Democratic candidates raised their hand. Even Republican nominee Curtis Sliwa is open to considering a rent freeze, as he indicated in a survey from the news outlet The City. Also, a rent freeze has occurred in New York City 3 times already, so with all that in mind, I think it's obvious that the policy isn't a radical or revolutionary idea. Whether or not the idea is a good one is a very different question, so now let's look specifically at what Mamdani is proposing and how reasonable it is. Roughly 1 million housing units are categorized as rent stabilized. A unit being rent stabilized means that its rent may not be increased by more than a certain percentage each year, although there are exceptions to this. The percentage in question is voted on by the 9 members of the Rent Guidelines Board. If the Rent Guidelines Board sets the maximum annual increase to 0%, then landlords of rent-stabilized apartments may not raise the rent during that year, and this is what is referred to as a rent freeze. Mamdani's plan is to freeze the rent during every year he is in office. As mayor, Mamdani will not have direct control over the actions of the Rent Guidelines Board, so he cannot decide to freeze the rent by himself, but he will be able to appoint new members to the board to replace those whose terms have ended, and in this way he can indirectly influence whether or not a rent freeze will occur. Okay, so those are the basics. Now let's go through the rationale behind freezing the rent. Despite the productivity of workers constantly increasing, wages have been stagnating. At the same time, rent has increased at a much faster rate than minimum wage. Add these things together, and it's obvious that renters are likely not in a good place right now, and that their situation is only getting worse. The data reflects this. More than 45% of renters in rent-stabilized apartments are rent-burdened, meaning that they spend more than 30% of their income on rent, with about half of those also being considered severely rent-burdened, meaning that they pay more than 50% of their income on rent. And of course, rent is not the only economic burden people have. The cost of living in general has been increasing, and more people have been forced to leave the city, become homeless, take on debt, work 2 or more jobs, and so on. A rent freeze is intended to provide a small amount of economic relief to those that are struggling by assuring them that at least that expense will not continue to rise. Now let's go through the criticisms of Mamdani's rent freeze and see if they stand up to scrutiny. One type of criticism from those that oppose a rent freeze focuses on the impacts it would have on landlords. Specifically, they say that a rent freeze will hurt landlords that are already struggling, potentially putting them out of business, and that without increasing the rent, landlords will be unable to cover the costs of repairs or improvements to apartments, so they'll actually be incentivized to cut costs by not doing those things. Honestly, criticism like this ignores the economic reality of the situation, as well as certain facets of the law. First of all, the net operating income, which is basically the profit a landlord generates through renting, has been increasing at a much faster rate than maintenance costs have. So in general, it's becoming more profitable to be a landlord as rents continue to rise year after year. At the same time, regardless of this increase in net operating income, many landlords are neglecting their responsibilities. Code violations are on the rise, with many of them taking an egregiously long time to get dealt with, if they even get dealt with at all. With all of that said, it is true that some rent-stabilized landlords are struggling to make ends meet, but there are many ways that landlords can get help from the city that does not involve allowing all rents to increase. One example is the Home Fix program, which provides low interest or even interest-free, potentially forgivable loans to help certain landlords afford repairs. Another example is the many ways a landlord can raise the rent beyond the limit set by the Rent Guidelines Board, even during a rent freeze. There may be more than this, but the 4 I found are comparative hardship, alternative hardship, major capital improvements, and individual apartment improvements. The former 2 are designed to help landlords that are struggling financially, and the latter 2 are designed to help landlords afford improving their properties. These are granted on a case-by-case basis, and are a much better way to help struggling landlords specifically, while at the same time not hurting all tenants by allowing a blanket increase in rent across the board. So overall, landlords are doing okay. Their profit has been steadily increasing, and a rent freeze won't inhibit their ability to maintain their properties. The second type of criticism claims that a rent freeze will negatively impact the market overall, potentially causing a housing shortage or preventing new apartments from getting built. This line of reasoning basically says that constricting the profitability of being a landlord makes it less attractive, so less landlords would be interested in building new apartments or might try to make more money by selling their properties rather than renting them. First of all, we have to keep in mind that Mamdani's rent freeze will only be for rent-stabilized units. Most of the housing market will not be affected. And second, at risk of repeating myself, landlords are doing okay. They are literally property owners earning a passive income. And during a rent freeze, landlords are still getting paid. Yes, preventing the rent from growing does prevent their profit from growing, but the city's goal shouldn't be to make being a landlord as attractive as possible by allowing them to squeeze tenants for as much money as possible. Now, on the other point of new housing being built, this is another issue Mamdani plans to address as mayor. This video is about Mamdani's rent freeze, not his plan to build housing. So I'll just briefly summarize that his platform says that the city has waited too long for the private sector to solve its housing crisis, and that he plans to triple the city's production of affordable housing, investing $100 billion into the project over the course of 10 years. Alright, so with all the research I've done, I personally think Mamdani's rent freeze is reasonable. Despite its vocal detractors, it's one of his most popular policies, and I think it resonates with people because they're really hurting economically. Of course, a rent freeze alone won't solve New York City's affordability issues, but as I've alluded to, Mamdani has many other policies that are intended to work together alongside a rent freeze to help those that are struggling. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Do you agree? Disagree? Is there anything I missed or didn't consider? Let me know in the comments, and thanks very much for watching.